Mr. President, today I want to talk about some new information regarding the Iran nuclear deal negotiated by the Obama administration. This agreement is known sometimes as the JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is an agreement that was reached by the Obama administration. It was voted on after the fact by this body, and actually a majority of members of the House and Senate chose to oppose the agreement, but not enough to be able to stop it. So it went into effect, and as you know, it's gotten some play recently as the administration has pulled out the United States' involvement in that agreement. But what I'm going to talk about this evening is new information that has come from the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which I chair. We began an investigation into one aspect of this agreement nearly 2 years ago, and it was based on information we received that, despite the Obama administration's claims to the contrary, that there may have been some undisclosed arrangement with Iran to grant them access to the U.S. financial system. Recall that the basic deal with Iran went like this. In exchange for Iran agreeing to certain limitations regarding its nuclear arsenal, including limiting the new production of enriched uranium for 15 years, the United States and other members of the United Nations Security Council would agree to lift some economic sanctions on Iran. That was the basic construct of the agreement. As part of that agreement, which included ongoing deadlines that needed to be met over a period of years, the United States lifted what are often referred to as secondary sanctions. So these weren't direct sanctions on the United States, but these were sanctions on foreign companies, foreign entities, and foreign countries that do business with those under U.S. sanction, in this case, Iran. So under the Iran deal, other countries were now allowed for the first time to freely do business with Iran without the risk of the U.S. imposing sanctions on them. And that was something that was very important to Iran. Iran was also allowed to access money that had been frozen abroad in other countries because the threat of U.S. sanctions against cooperating foreign partners no longer existed. At the same time, really because of the non-nuclear concerns regarding Iran, including supporting terrorism, human rights violations, ballistic missile development, and basic destabilization of the region, U.S. sanctions against Iran remained in place. So our primary sanctions stayed in place. This means Iran was banned from directly accessing the U.S. financial system, and banks and other private institutions were still banned from accessing U.S. financial systems on behalf of Iran. This is a big deal. That's sort of the one thing that any country that's sanctioned really wants, is access to our financial system, because it is so intertwined with the rest of the world. They were still banned from directly accessing our U.S. financial system. This, by the way, was a key point that the Obama administration made clear throughout the negotiations with Iran. They repeatedly provided assurances to the American people that Iran would not be granted access to the U.S. financial system. They made the same claims publicly before congressional committees and in testimony up here. On July 23, 2015, before the deal was implemented, a senior Treasury official, as an example, said, quote, "Iranian banks will not be able to clear U.S. dollars through New York, hold correspondent account relationship with U.S. financial institutions, or enter into financing arrangements with U.S. banks," end quote. This testimony further stated that, quote, "Iran, in other words, will continue to be denied access to the world's largest financial and commercial market." That's us. That's what they said. On August 5th, 2015, the then acting Undersecretary of Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs that, quote, "Iran will be denied access to the world's most important market and unable to deal with the world's most important currency," that being the dollar. He also stated, quote, "Iranian banks will not be able to clear U.S. dollars through New York, hold correspondent account relationships with the U.S. financial institution, or enter into financial arrangements with U.S. banks." So these claims were pretty clear, very clear. The U.S. financial system was not to be used. Despite these claims, the very next year, just after implementation of the deal had begun, we started hearing reports that the Obama administration was considering changing course on this policy. This obviously raised a lot of concerns from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle because the Iranian regime remained a state sponsor of terror, the #1 state sponsor of terror, continued to threaten ballistic missile activities, continued to commit egregious violations of human rights, as it still does today. In fact, in July of 2016, a bipartisan group of 35 senators sent a letter to President Obama expressing deep concern over these rumors that Iran might be granted access to the U.S. dollar and to the U.S. financial system. It was about that time that we started our investigation in the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And again, we did so because we were hearing these rumors that this might be happening. Today, after a nearly 2-year investigation, we unveiled a report which detailed for the first time how, despite their claims to the contrary, the Obama administration secretly granted a specific license authorizing the conversion of Iranian assets worth billions of dollars using the U.S. financial system. Remember that this happened despite repeated assurances to the public and Congress that Iran would not be granted access to the U.S. financial system. Specifically, the Obama administration asked 2 banks, U.S. banks, to execute the transactions. Fortunately, these 2 big U.S. multinational banks refused to do so. The report outlines key findings and recommendations designed to prevent this from happening in the future. What funds are we talking about? Well, before the Iran deal was implemented, Iran transferred approximately $13 billion in oil revenue assets to bank accounts overseas. They deposited $8.8 billion of that oil revenue in one bank account at Bank Muscat in Muscat, Oman. 3 days after implementation of the agreement on January 19, 2016, Bank Muscat contacted the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, which is the agency within the Treasury Department responsible for enforcing U.S. sanctions. They did this on behalf of the Central Bank of Iran. So this is the Oman Bank contacting the U.S. Treasury Department saying, we need your help. Bank Muscat sought to convert $5.7 billion in Omani money, the rial, into euros on behalf of Iran. Because the rial is pegged to the U.S. dollar, the most efficient conversion was with an intermediary step through a U.S. bank using U.S. dollars. So that's what they asked for. Iran was eager to convert this money into a more universal currency and was adamant about getting this done quickly. Despite its public stance that it would not provide Iran access to U.S. financial system and U.S. banks, on February 24, 2016, OFAC, again, this Department of Treasury agency, issued a specific license to Bank Muscat authorizing Iranian assets worth nearly $5.7 billion to flow through the U.S. financial system. Today, I heard some say that this specific license was just a narrow exemption or just a minor fix. To that, I direct you to an email from a Bank Muscat official which said that, quote, the license was a gigantic breakthrough which has assured Iran of almost full global financial inclusion, end quote. Doesn't sound like a narrow fix to me. Anyone suggesting that the specific license didn't grant access to the U.S. financial system hasn't read the report from the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. I would encourage them to do that. But they also haven't read the Obama administration's emails that we cite in this report. Don't take my word for it, though. As one State Department official wrote to his Iranian counterpart, quote, OFAC informed Bank Muscat and the Central Bank of Oman today that they have a license to convert Iranian assets in its account to euros through the U.S. financial system, end quote. That's from the State Department at the time. Members of the Obama administration clearly understood that something was wrong here. This was not part of the Iran deal. A senior State Department official wrote at the time in 2016 that the transaction was, quote, prohibited by U.S. sanctions that are still in place, which we were clear we would not be removing as part of the JCPOA, end quote. That same official wrote that granting the transaction, quote, exceeded the JCPOA commitments because it authorized the use of the U.S. financial system. Let me repeat this so it's crystal clear. The Obama administration, State Department, completely understood this concession, that giving Iran access to the U.S. financial system was prohibited by U.S. sanctions. That I quote again, "we were clear we would not be removing." Those aren't my words. They aren't the words of the subcommittee. Those are the words of a senior State Department official at the time. There was no confusion about this, as far as we can tell. Shortly after issuing the specific license to use the U.S. financial system to convert the reals, a Treasury official wrote in an email of the matter, quote, "I think we earned the right to never discuss this matter ever again." I disagree. I think we have to talk about this, and to talk about how before, during, and after the Treasury Department and the State Department officials testified in front of Congress that Iran would not have access to the U.S. financial system, they worked behind the scenes to allow exactly that. We have to talk about this to be sure it doesn't happen again. Following the issuance of the specific license, OFAC contacted these two U.S. banks, urging them to convert Iran's reals to U.S. dollars. It appears the administration was becoming desperate. Iran was making both public and private claims they were not getting the benefit of the deal they expected, and asserting that the deal could fall apart. You all may remember that time period when there were threats by Iran to pull out of the deal. We discovered an email where a State Department official even suggested that the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Treasury should contact these U.S. banks themselves and encourage them to facilitate this conversion. By the way, we have no evidence that those calls were made, and I'm not suggesting that. Both U.S. banks declined to complete the transaction. According to the banks, they refused to do so due to compliance, reputational, and legal risks associated with doing business with Iran. They did the right thing. Because U.S. banks were unwilling to convert the funds despite requests from the Obama administration, ultimately, Bank Muscat was unable to effectuate the conversion using the U.S. dollar. The State Department has now told us that Iran, over time, converted the funds into euros in small increments using European banks. The only reason the transaction wasn't executed through the U.S. financial system was because these two U.S. banks refused, despite pressure, and even though the administration asked them to help convert the money. After the Iran deal was implemented and after the Treasury Department had issued a specific license, the Obama administration continued to maintain the false notion that it had not provided Iran access to the U.S. financial system. On April 5, 2016, Ambassador Thomas Shannon said, and I quote, "There is no exchange of dollars inside the U.S. financial system. We have not allowed an access to our larger financial system," end quote. On May 25, 2016, the acting Undersecretary of Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence said, quote, "But Secretary Liu has said exactly what I have said here today, and I know he was looking forward to me being here to be able to relay his views on this. Iran will not have access to our financial system." On June 7, 2016, Treasury wrote a letter to Senators Kirk and Rubio saying, quote, "The administration has not been and is not planning to grant Iran access to the U.S. financial system, period." Time after time, before, during, and after the Iran deal, the Obama administration misled the American people and misled Congress on this point. I believe it was because the administration was so eager to make sure this deal was going to work. They wanted to keep Iran in the deal. A report also shows that the State Department and Treasury Department held at least 200 meetings or road shows around the world to encourage other countries to do business with Iran. In the road shows, Treasury Department officials also downplayed any potential future penalties or fines that might result from sanctions. During one roadshow, the head of OFAC reportedly told the audience that, quote, 95% of the time OFAC sees an apparent violation, it results in a simple warning letter or no enforcement action at all. So this is the head of the agency at Treasury responsible for enforcing sanctions saying 95% of the time it results in a simple warning letter or no enforcement action. We shouldn't be telling anyone that we only enforce sanctions, one of our most important foreign policy tools, just 5% of the time. One European regulator who attended an OFAC roadshow commented that foreign financial institutions felt, in his words, political pressure to conduct business with Iran and Iranian companies. Sanctions are a vital foreign policy tool, and yet in this case, the Obama administration seemed to be sending the wrong message about their enforcement and effectiveness. The PSI report released today outlines key transparency recommendations to ensure that undisclosed side deals like this never happen again, including requiring the current administration to keep congressional committees of jurisdiction up to date on the status of any future negotiations with Iran, disclosing to Congress any specific licenses that are proposed, and putting in place stronger enforcement of U.S. sanctions. Going forward, this report also underscores how important the U.S. financial system is to global finance markets, and it gives us a substantial amount of leverage in negotiations. We should choose to use it. We now have an opportunity to fix the fundamental flaws in the Iran deal and put in place a stronger agreement that truly protects America's national security interests and the interest of our allies in the region. Recall that the Iran deal was opposed, again, by a bipartisan majority of this body. I support our efforts to work with our European allies to put in place a better deal that truly represents our own national security interests and those of our allies in the region. And I hope this report helps us to avoid the kinds of problems that occurred last time, the next time around. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back my time. I note the absence of a quorum.